Let you know there were 22 or 23 questions submitted, so there's no way we're going to get through all of them tonight. In fact, there's no way we're going to get through all of them probably in 2 nights. So as Adrian has said, there were a couple that I really could spend how long is a piece of string? There's a couple that are quite important issues, and I felt that I would take a full time at Youth Fellowship to answer them. So the first one is the head covering. Immediately, fellas think, that's just for the girls, but there's 2 parts to that question. So why should women wear hats in public worship, but also why men shouldn't? So that question's not just for the girls. It's equally as important to the fellas whenever we understand what it teaches. So I just don't want to see all girls here next week, okay? All right, fellas. So there's also the issue of music in the church. So there are 2 questions. One was about what we sing, and one question was about how we sing, i.e. instruments. So I want to just deal with the issue of music in the church in general in a few weeks' time. And then there's another great question, what will we do in heaven? Again, like you could spend all night on that. So what I'm going to do is probably some Sunday evening answer that question, and possibly in the next few weeks actually. So for those of you who don't normally come to our church or whatever, you'll find the answer to that question probably in YouTube or Facebook in a few weeks' time. So those 3 questions are quite big questions, and they'll be answered. Another thing I would say, young people, is just before Adrian starts to ask the questions, for most of them, except for the first few actually, for most of them I will turn you to a verse that's like the main verse to answer the question. But as you can probably, or I'm sure you're aware, it's going to take more than one verse sometimes to answer the question, because of the nature of the question. So some of them are a bit more technical and a bit more to do with history or Bible translations, that kind of thing. So some of them are quite heavy. I'll try and just give you the simple stuff that you guys really need to know, okay? So without further ado, I reckon we'll get about 8 done tonight. So we'll not hold Adrian back anymore. Sorry, this as well. There's some people aren't here tonight wanted this recorded. I do not want this recorded. I want to make that perfectly clear. So that's for their benefit, not for mine. All right. I'm not one to look at me in front of the camera, just in case you're wondering that. Okay. All right.
Okay. So first question: what does the Free Presbyterian Church believe regarding baptism?
Okay. So baptism, young people, is it's quite a complicated issue. The main thing, young people, to understand is this: if you're a Christian, at some stage in life, you should be baptized. All right. Command of the Bible is repent and be baptized. And when you look through the New Testament, all of a lot of the conversions, they basically became Christians and then they were baptized. So it's important that at some stage in your life, young people, if you're a Christian, that you are baptized. The question is, however, what do we as a church believe in baptism? So in churches, I'm sure you know that the Free Presbyterian Church is not the only church in the world. So you have kind of 2 thoughts on baptism, okay? You have what you are probably most aware of, so people who are Christians being baptized, i.e. believers' baptism. And that's when you become a Christian, you be baptized. And then some denominations, i.e. Presbyterian churches, they also would teach that believers and their children can be baptized. Now, we are Free Presbyterian Church. So we allow either, because to cut a long story short, young people, for centuries, in fact for thousands of years, people have debated about the issue, and it's going to be debated about throughout time really. So our church is open on it. So that's sometimes people say that's a cop-out, because Baptist church, for example, will only baptize believers, and Presbyterian churches will only do baptism in a certain way, and other denominations as well, so Reformed Presbyterian, Evangelical Presbyterian, and other Reformed denominations. We're open on the matter, so you can kind of hold either. But as I said, to go back to the start, young people, and the main thing is this: as a Christian, you should be baptized at some stage. So, I want to make that very clear.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just ask just another thing?
Yeah.
Could you just sort of make it clear to them why?
Why we should be baptized?
Yes, why? Just to give them a sort of a, I don't
Yeah.
want to put you on the spot.
That's okay, yeah.
It's just to give them clarity.
Yeah. Why should
Why
anybody be
why?
baptized? It doesn't make you a Christian when you're baptized as a believer, but it's one of the key signs that you are a believer. So whenever you go through the book of Acts, so in Acts chapter 2, when the thousands were saved, one of the first things they did was they were baptized. The Philippian jailer in Acts 16, whenever he was saved, immediately he was baptized. In Acts chapter 8, the Ethiopian eunuch was saved out in the middle of the desert when Philip brought him the gospel. And again, immediately he asked the question, what hinders me to be baptized? So it's just a symbol. I could say a lot more about it, but it's essentially a symbol of the fact that you are now a Christian. It's one of the key symbols. Just like the Lord's table is as well. It's a sacrament or a symbol. There's a lot more I could say about that, but very simply, that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so why does the Free Presbyterian Church hold to the King James Version of the Bible? Are other versions less accurate?
So this is going to be, just as a heads up, this is going to be the toughest and most technical question that I will answer. All right, so we've saved the best to the start. The long and short answer of that is yes. So to kind of boil this down to you young people, God gave us the Old Testament in Hebrew, and He gave us the New Testament in Greek. Now, when we talk about the Bible being the inspired Word of God, and God writing them, and God giving us the Bible, that's what we're talking about. So the English Bible, whether it's the KJV, whether it's the NKJV, the ESV, the NIV, they are all translations. We must remember that, okay? So they are not the original Greek New Testament that we believe God gave the Apostle Paul or Luke or whoever. So we believe that the King James Version of the Bible is the most accurate translation. Now, there's two things to bear in mind, young people, when we come to the issue of Bible translation. The first thing is where do we actually get the translation from, i.e. what original text or what manuscripts or original texts, and then the second thing is how it's actually translated. Okay, so where did you get this? Where did the NIV? Where did the KJV? Where did the NKJV? The ESV? Whatever the translation is, what source did it come from? And then how actually was it translated? What you have in front of you. So, in terms of source, the King James Bible came from what is called a majority text. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, very simply, to give you an example of this, let's say they look at all of the manuscripts of the Old Testament, and 98 or 99 or 100 of them out of 100 all have a certain verse with certain words in it. The majority of them, the majority of these manuscripts have that verse in it. So the translators of the KJV have went, okay, it's in the majority, therefore we accept that to be the word of God. Every other translation, even the New King James, which some people believe is just updated English of the KJV, but it's not. So every other translation, ESV, New King James, New International Version, New Living Translation, etc., American Standard Version, etc., 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 every other translation comes from what is called a minority text. Now, there's not really all that much difference in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, this is massive. So, if we had an NIV with us tonight, and I asked you to turn to Mark 16, verse 15, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, you wouldn't be able to turn to it. It's not there. Because it came from a different source. Or, John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. So you know the woman caught in adultery, and then the Pharisees come bring the woman to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Him that's without sin, cast the first stone." Again, that is not found in many of the modern versions. Some of the modern versions, like the ESV, will have it in brackets, which is essentially a way of saying we're not sure if this should be in the Bible or not. Another key verse in that, although there is a bit of debate about this, 1 John 5 verse 7, there are three that bear record in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Spirit. A really key verse about the Trinity, and that is not in many of the new translations. Another issue, so let's say to take other versions and it comes from a different source. This shows you another reason why this is really important. So you might think, well, what's the relevance of this? Why is this important? Another thing, and there's many issues, but just to highlight another one for you young people. When we think about the virgin birth of Christ, in the Greek New Testament, there's a specific word for virgin and a specific word for like man or woman. So if you would read in the Greek New Testament, Matthew 1, for example, where it talks about the Virgin Mary, where you're going to see the word parthenos in the Greek New Testament, that's the word for virgin. In many of the new translations, the word virgin is substituted with woman or young woman. The NIV, you find this, for example. Now, what's the importance of that? Well, when we're thinking about the Virgin Mary, it's vital. Because if Mary's just called a young woman, that could imply that she had Jesus by natural means, without wanting to say too much more, not miraculously given. So the KJV is very, very clear on the fact that it says virgin, and we translate, we have that word, we translate it as virgin. So that's just two examples of why the source is important, okay? So then you come to the issue of not only where we get what we have from, but how is it actually translated. So there's two main ways of translating the Bible. I'll give you the correct terms for those who are interested in it, and I'll explain what those terms mean. Formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. Formal equivalence is essentially word for word, literal, grammatical. So the Lord is my shepherd. So where possible, they've gone to the Hebrew Old Testament or the Greek New Testament, and they've tried to do it literally word for word. Now the ESV uses this type of translation as well, and possibly other versions of the ESV comes to mind. But again, to use the ESV, it comes from a different source. So although they've tried to use the right type of Bible translation method, i.e. Formal equivalence, it still comes from a faulty source or a less reliable source. So many of the new versions use what's called dynamic equivalence, which is essentially they take the whole verse and then they get the general meaning of that verse and then they bring it to English. So to give you a really bad example of this, it's nearly, I have to be honest with you, I nearly think it's blasphemy, but it's in one of the very new translations. I'm sure you've heard of the Message as a translation of the Bible. Well, it has, instead of praying in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, it has, give us this day our 3 square meals. Now, what's wrong with that? You might say, well, what about countries where they don't get 3 square meals? You know? So it just takes the idea and kind of puts it into our culture. And yes, for our culture it's good to have 3 square meals, of course. Most of the world don't get 3 square meals. That's just the long and short of it. 2/3 of the world live on $2 a day. So the main things, where it comes from, and then how it's actually translated into English. So we believe that the source is good and the best in this one, KJV, and also then how it's actually translated, how we have arrived in to what we actually have today, how we've translated it, or say we, how the original translators have translated it. So, okay.
All right. So why do we have a Free Presbyterian Church?
Again, this is more historical. So I kind of have to give you the backdrop to where church was at about 100 or so years ago in Northern Ireland. So there's obviously no Free Presbyterian Church because the Free Presbyterian Church is only 75 years old next year. So about 100 years ago, there was a man in the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church has been in Ulster for hundreds of years. There was a man in the Presbyterian Church who was a rank compromiser, and he taught, now I'm going to quote him verbatim here, he taught that Jesus Christ was the illegitimate child of a Roman soldier. He taught certain books of the Bible, for example Leviticus, that they were like and I'm quoting him here, they were like a cottage pudding, hard to find the fruit in it. So you imagine taking some of the books of the Bible and say, it's hard to find anything good in there. That's really distasteful. So this was a man who was high up in the Presbyterian Church, and they put him on a heresy trial. Essentially, they tried him for his beliefs. Now, you would think that someone like that who believes that they would be ousted of the denomination. That's what would happen to me if I taught that, and rightly so. The Presbyterian Church made that man the moderator of their church, i.e. the most important individual. They also made him principal of their Bible college. So they gave him essentially influence of the whole denomination in terms of leading it and setting the tone of it, and also influencing a generation of ministers. What you essentially had then, and I'm not tearing every single Presbyterian church with the same brush because there are some more evangelical than others. However, what you essentially had was this man influencing a generation of ministers, and of course, I'm sure you can imagine the outworking of that. So there was a lot of people in general in Northern Ireland who were not really all that happy with the state of their church. In 75 years ago then, a Presbyterian church in Crossgar, the Sarah Presbyterian Church, it's still there today, they wanted to have a gospel mission, and rightly so. What a good thing to do, reach out to the local community. And they wanted the speaker to be Ian Paisley. Now, Ian Paisley was not a Presbyterian minister, he was not a Free Presbyterian because the Free Presbyterian Church didn't exist. He was essentially he was in a church that had no other affiliation. It was an evangelical church. They wanted him to come and preach in their church hall in this mission. The Down Presbytery came and overruled the local church and said, you cannot use your own church facilities for this gospel mission, because a preacher of the gospel was coming to the area, essentially. So what happened was, and this is where I think people need to understand, people say Dr. Paisley started our denomination. Elders from a Presbyterian church started our denomination. They left the Sarah Presbyterian Church, all of them but one stayed. They left, they went down to a barn down the road, they had their gospel mission, 80 people were saved, and that was the start of the first Free Presbyterian Church in Crossgar. So the Crossgar Church is our oldest church. And what you essentially had was, from then on, this kind of thing happened around the country. So it happened in Resharkin. There was compromise up there, and a group of people left their local Presbyterian church, came and started their own church. Dr. Paisley was about the fourth or the fifth. His church in Belfast came and kind of joined this fledgling group of congregations. And essentially what happened then is, around the country then, free churches began to form and appear here, there and everywhere. But I want to make it clear to you tonight, young people, that whilst Dr. Paisley was certainly instrumental and used mightily of God, it was Presbyterian elders who left the Presbyterian Church, started the Free Presbyterian Church. And the Reverend Cecil Maneri was the first Free Presbyterian minister and is now in glory. Why do we have one? That's essentially why. That's the history of our denomination. Because there was obvious compromise in that church and then also in other churches as well. And it kind of all came to a head 75 years ago. That's essentially what happened, really. So look, I'm giving you the bare facts of that, young people. That is the facts as they stand. And that's why our church exists today. For simply the preaching of the gospel. It was born out of that, and that's why we exist to this day. Okay?
Okay. So, what drew you yourself to be a minister in the Free Presbyterian Church rather than other denominations?
Okay, so as many of you know, I wasn't raised in our church. And when I became a Christian, I attended another denomination for about the first year. What drew me to our church, young people, very simply is this. Whenever I came to Bible class, and I'm sure some of you are in Sunday school and Bible class, whenever I was first saved, to be honest with you, I was saved from alcohol, saved from sin, obviously, but one of my main things was I was drinking. And when I first became a Christian, my parents didn't go to church, and so I grew up thinking, well, this is okay still. Now, obviously it wasn't. It was a 13-year-old. It wasn't okay. But the thing that really impressed me was the first time I set foot in our Bible class in our church in Cumber, the Bible class leader didn't know my situation. It was my first time there, and he opened up the Bible, Proverbs 20, verse 1, and he said, today, young people, we're going to deal with the subject of alcohol and what it has to say in the Bible. Now, the thing that really attracted me to the denomination was whenever they had a question, much like what we're doing tonight, what does the Bible say? What does the Bible say? And in a nutshell, young people, that's why I came to our denomination when I was 14. Then, whenever I started to pray about what I would do, whether it be a minister, I was seriously considering being a missionary. So I did look at other colleges. I looked at Baptist colleges in America. I looked at missionary colleges in America and missionary college in England. But again, as we believe and teach, everything that I analysed our denomination, how they operated, how they were structured, how they were run, they had an answer for everything in the Bible. It was straight. What does the Bible say? What does the Bible say? And so I came to the conclusion that, well, if you're going to spend the rest of your life either as a minister or a missionary, well, you want to be in a place that lives by the Bible, that comes to the Bible for questions and answers. And so really, everything we do is based in the Bible, young people. And look, that's what church is all about at the end of the day. That's where we go to. It's our sole rule of faith and practice. So that is what drew me to be, first of all, a Christian in our denomination, and then now a minister in our denomination as well, because we try to do everything by the Bible.
So, did Jesus go to heaven in between his death and resurrection?
This is a really good question, and it's a question that takes a lot of thought. So, you obviously know, young people, Jesus died on the Friday, died on the cross. He was put in a tomb, he was buried, his body that is, and then he was raised again on what we believe to be Sunday. So the question arises, well, what happened to his soul in between? So we're body and soul. His body was put in a tomb. What happened to his soul? Some would teach that he actually went to hell, and they get this from 1 Peter 3:19. I'm not going to go there. It takes a lot of explaining to do. But you think, young people, let's go back to what was the cross? The cross was suffering for sin. It was Christ dying as our substitute on the cross. Now, even the youngest here tonight, or some of the younger ones here tonight, you'll know what the last thing that Jesus cried out on the cross before he died. It is finished, right? So what was finished? His suffering for sin. So there was really no need for the Lord Jesus Christ to go to hell in between dying and being raised again, because his suffering was finished. Him suffering God's wrath was finished. He cried out, John 19:30, it is finished. So the question is, well, where did he go in between? What happened to him in between? And as I said, there's speculation. Some believe he went to hell, and some believe he went to heaven. It's difficult to give a definite answer, but one of the main things that seems to suggest that yes, he did go to heaven, to answer the question, is what he said to the dying thief on the cross. He was very clear, wasn't he, in Luke 23, today thou shalt be with me where? In paradise, in heaven. So he said to the dying thief, you're going to die today on the cross, and you're going to be with me in paradise today. So it seems to me that after his suffering for sin was finished, that he went, his soul went to heaven to be with the Father for the 3 the 3 days, and then was reunited with his body whenever he was resurrected on the first Sunday morning. It's not clear cut, but you have to take Christ at what he said, and he said, "Today you'll be with me in paradise or in heaven." So I think it suggests that he went to heaven, but it's a good question and quite a deep question as well. So,
Thank you. How do we have different races, i.e. black and white and so on?
all right. So there's kind of a lot to this question. I think what the person's really getting at is not just races, but I think even cultures that come with races. So we know where the different languages came from. So Genesis chapter 11, you have the Tower of Babel. And Genesis 11 verse 1, it says, "The whole earth was of one language and of one speech." So they all spoke the same language at the beginning of Genesis 11 verse 1. Remember, they tried to build the Tower of Babel then. And Genesis 11 verse 7, God says, "Go to, let us go down and confound their language so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the different languages that we have today, originally it comes from Genesis chapter 11. The question then really is, why do we have different races, i.e. black and white? It's a simple answer when you know the answer. So turn to Acts chapter 17, please, and verse 26. This is a key to understanding the different races, so-called, of the world. So in Genesis 17, the Apostle Paul is preaching in Athens. They've all gathered together in Mars Hill. And Genesis 11 and verse 26, and it says there, speaking here about God. So verse 25, he gives to all life, breath, and of all things. Verse 26, and this is key, "And hath made of one blood, all nations of men, for to dwell on the face of the earth." So he's basically saying all men, all nations, every country, every nation is of one blood. Now, what does that mean? Well, really it has the idea of one origin, one stock, and what you can gather from that is that all our skin, now stay with me on this, all of our skin is the one colour, in the sense that we all have brown pigment in our skin, but some who have darker colour and some who have lighter colour, well, it's all to do with the amount of brown pigment in your skin. So we're actually all brown. Some are just very light brown and some are very dark. And the Bible says we're all of one blood. So what does that teach you and I in this day and age, young people? There's no place for racism as a Christian. No place for racism as a Christian. So remember that, please. He hath made of one blood all nations to dwell on the face of the earth. So, I don't know if you knew that or not, but answers in Genesis, that's where I got that answer from. And they've gone into all of this in much more detail. So, yeah.
Okay. If murder is so wrong and breaking God's commandments, how was Elisha justified in calling out the bears to kill the children?
Yeah, so this person's asked about a very specific incident in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 2. So I want you to turn to that, please. 2 Kings chapter 2. And you remember Elisha, he followed the prophet Elijah. So remember, Elijah went up to heaven in 2 Kings 2. His mantle fell down miraculously, his clothing, and then Elisha picked up the mantle and he took the mantle up. So Elisha followed Elijah, and look at verses 23 and 24 of 2 Kings chapter 2. So this is the incident that people are talking about. So 2 Kings 2 verse 23, and it says there, 2 Kings 2:23, "He went up from thence unto Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city." Now the word children here has the idea of inexperienced, so not necessarily young children, but more inexperienced ones, and really it's teenagers, it's youths. That's really what it's talking about here. So as he's going to Bethel, there came forth little children out of the city and mocked him and said to him, "Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head." So go on up, baldy. That's what they're saying. So verse 24, what's the result? He, that's Elisha, turned back and looked on them and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood and tore 42 children of them. So these not like you young people know you're really good, but Elisha's heading on his way to Bethel. A crowd appears out of the wood, and 42 of them says, "Hey Baldy, go on up. Hey Baldy, go on up." That's essentially what they're saying. And Elisha sets 2 bears on 42 of these young people, and they're destroyed. So the question is, if the commandments tell us that murder is wrong, why do we have something like that in the Bible? Good question. First thing I want to point out is it wasn't Elisha who murdered the 42 young people. It was the bear. All right, so that's the first thing. Elisha didn't literally take these ones by the hands and murder them. Another thing I would say is they're on their way. It says here in verse 23, they're on their way from thence unto Bethel. So they're going to Bethel. Bethel was a city, a really idolatrous city, like full of paganism, full of idolatrous worship, and it says these youths were probably engrossed in paganism and idolatrous worship. Now they say, "Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head." Go up. Remember who's just gone up to heaven? Elijah. Elijah went up to heaven, remember, in the chariot of fire, like a whirlwind. So what they're essentially saying is, go on up to heaven, you boy. You're just like your predecessor, just like the man you're following. And also the fact that they've said, "Thou bald head." Now, we don't actually know if Elisha was baldy or not. I tend to think, and I've spoke on this before and I've thought about it, I don't know if Elisha actually was baldy, to be honest with you. Baldness in the Old Testament was kind of a shameful thing. And it's hard for us to understand because we would just joke, today, "Hey baldy, go on ahead," But in Bible times, them saying "go up" was nearly like a sarcastic curse. It's not like us today. It's hard for us to enter into it. And the bald head, this was a real sign of disrespect. Now, Elisha, who was Elisha? Elisha was a prophet. He was a prophet sent by God. And so ultimately, them saying, "Go on up just like Elijah, play the man, just like your predecessor." Really what they were doing here, long story short, young people, is they were showing great contempt for God. Great contempt for the God who had sent Elisha. And so it was really a sign then and a warning to these youths. Now, it says there were 42 that were dealt with. That implies to me that the crowd was much bigger, and that 42, the main 42 protagonists of the thing, that they were dealt with. So it was really kind of a warning not to disrespect God, and the rest of the people would have been watching on and think, well, I'll certainly think twice about making fun of God through making fun of Elisha again. It also teaches us another thing, young people, to show respect for those who are in authority, because when we don't, well, it's ultimately showing contempt for the God who put them in authority. So it's a serious thing. You need to remember that. So, thank you.
So, is anger a sin, and how can we manage anger?
So there's 2 parts to this question. Obviously, is anger a sin? And then how can we deal with it? So, not all anger is sin. Ephesians 4:26 tells us this. "Be ye angry and sin not." Be ye angry and sin not. So God wouldn't tell us to be angry and sin not if we couldn't do it. Be angry but don't sin, but you can't do it. The Bible also tells us in Psalm 7 verse 11 that God is angry with the wicked every day. Now, God doesn't sin, Christ doesn't sin, and if God's angry with the wicked, then that can't be sinful anger. So there is such a thing as righteous anger, and times where it is okay to be angry. You think of Jesus, whenever he started his ministry, went into the temple, saw them gambling essentially, and he turned over the tables. He had righteous anger or righteous indignation. Now, he wasn't sinning. Christ didn't sin. So the first thing we need to understand is that there can be such a thing as righteous anger, where we don't sin but we're angry. We're angry essentially at sin. That's really, it's not wrong to be angry at sin. Where, of course, it can then become sin is when we think about the motives of what has made us angry. So, for example, pride, for example, or we get angry at the wrong doer and not the actual wrong action. So, to just kind of lash out at the wrong doer and not be angry at them, rather than be angry at the actual sin. Now, there's a fine line there, but and I could go on there, but essentially we are angry, and whenever we're angry for wrong reasons, for wrong motives, then it's sin. So how do we handle this anger, this wrong anger? Well, the first thing we need to do is think about what it is that's actually making you angry. Sometimes we can get angry and you think, well, what's making us angry? And sometimes we can be angry because God has sent a trial our way and we're angry at it. God's testing us and we're angry. So you think, for example, young people, of Joseph. Joseph could have got really angry at his brothers. Brothers have thrown him into the pit. Brothers have sold him as a slave to slave traders. Spent decades of his life in Egypt. And then, of course, the thing came full circle, didn't it? And he meets his brothers then, over 20 years later. And I'm sure if Joseph wasn't the man that he was, then maybe he could have been thinking to himself, well, I'm really, 20 years I've been holding it up, and I'm going to tell them exactly what I think. Joseph wasn't like that. Genesis 50 verse 20 tells us that Joseph said this to his brothers: you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God had a purpose in it, and so I wasn't going to be angry at God. So first of all, think about what it is that's actually making us angry. Secondly then, young people, whenever we're tempted to be angry, we need to remember that vengeance belongs to God. And if people do wrong on us, ultimately there's one who does right, and that's God. And God will deal with that person in his time. Then if anger does get the better of us, and let's face it, we're all sinners, so anger's going to get the better of us to a lesser or greater degree. I read a statistic in this question, I was thinking about it. 50% of people who do Christian counselling say that people who come to them for counselling, they have anger problems. So anger, sin, and anger boiling over, it's a major problem. So if you do boil over in anger, if you lose the rag with someone, whoever it might be, whether it's your family or friends, don't be afraid to say sorry. Ephesians 4:26 says, be ye angry and sin not. That's the first part of the verse, which we've thought about. And then it goes on to tell us, and let not the sun go down in your wrath. In other words, if there's times when you are angry, don't let it get to night time and you go to bed angry. Make sure you say sorry where you've been angry. So there's much more you could say about that, but hopefully that's just a few things to think about anyway.
Yep. So why did God punish all the world? Because of the sin of just Adam and Eve.
So I'm sure you've all heard this question, maybe even thought about it. Well, one man sinned and I have to pay for it. Does it seem fair? No? I'm sure you've all thought about that. Romans 5 verse 12 is the key verse to understanding why it is fair. And it says there, in fact we'll just turn to it because this is a really important verse. In understanding just how we stand before God and why ultimately we sin. So Romans 5 verse 12. And we'll do one or two more and then that'll do us, I think, but you're listening really, really well. Romans 5 verse 12. So it says there, wherefore as by one man sin entered the world, so it's speaking here of Adam, and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. And verse 19 as well of Romans 5, As by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Who's ever heard of the feds? You're all smirking. American TV, the feds, the police. It's the American way of saying the police. Someone's pulled over by the police. Oh, the feds pulled me over. You've all heard that, I'm sure. Maybe none of you watch American TV. No, that's okay. You're all very good. Okay, so whenever they're talking about the feds, those who know what I'm talking about, when they're talking the police, they call the police the feds. Let's think about we call them the police, they call them the feds. Who is a policeman in society? He's not the law, right? But he is a representative of the law. So if a policeman pulls over someone for speeding and he books him for speeding, he's not the law himself, but he's a representative of the law and he's enforcing the law. Now, the police, the reason I've talked about the feds there, the word fed or federal, so the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the word federal means representative, all right? So when we think about Adam, theologians would talk about Adam being, now this is quite deep, so just listen to this. They would talk about Adam being mankind's federal head. So what does that mean? That means that whenever Adam was there in the garden, and God put him in the garden, told him to work, and told him, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he was a federal head of mankind in the sense that he was our representative. So whenever he's put in the garden in Genesis 2, he was given Eve and told, don't eat of the tree, he was put in what was called a state of probation or a state of testing. So God put Adam to the test to see would he be perfect. And Adam failed the test. And because Adam is our federal head, whenever he failed the test, he represented mankind. And so essentially, we all failed the test. And that's where we get our original sinful nature from. So it was passed down through every human. That's why in Genesis 4 and 5, you have the children of Adam and Eve. You have Seth and Cain and Abel, and you have their children. It's for various reasons, but one of the main reasons is to show that Adam was a sinner, and then, well, we all know about Cain and Abel and what happened there. Cain certainly was a sinner, and then everything that comes. So we inherited Adam's sinful nature. We talk about original sin. And you'll notice here, the question sometimes people say, well, why was it fair? Well, look again at Romans 5:19. By one man's disobedience many were made sinners, but look at the other side of the coin. By the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Who do you think it's talking about there? Who's the one who was perfectly obedient? Christ, Jesus. So Jesus, whenever he died on the cross, he was the federal head of all of his believers. And so it works both ways. Whenever he died on the cross, he's representing everybody who places their trust in him. So just as Adam sinned in the garden and he represented all man, so Jesus, when he died on the cross as God and man, he was the federal head, the representative of all who will place their faith and trust in him. So there's the other side of this as well. So there's a sense in which, we might feel a sense of injustice because of Adam and Eve, but when we think about it correctly, then it's right. So we'll do is there only two left, Adrian, by Mike? Okay, we'll do the two. They're fairly simple, and I think they're a bit easier. So
is there life outside of Earth?
Okay, so people are asking there essentially about aliens and stuff. So rather than say yes or no and give you my honest opinion on it, is there life outside of Earth? Well, we know this, Genesis 1 verse 1. God created what? The heavens and the earth. So he created all the stars and all the planets, and he also made the earth. Right? Colossians 1:16. By him were all things created, things in heaven, things in earth, Visible, invisible, all things were made by him and for him. So the Bible talks about God making the heavens, the planets, the universe, and of course the earth. Now, we'll have to just take the Bible at what it says. There's no mention of life on any of the other planets in the Bible. There's no mention of it. Also, when you think about what the Bible says, it speaks about generally God's plan for this earth. God has a special plan for this earth and his people on this earth. He has a special plan. The Bible focuses in on the earth that you and I live on. So the earth is special to him. And for that reason, I think that because the Bible says that there isn't life on other planets, and because the earth is at the centre of everything, people, obviously Jesus and Jesus returning, I tend to think that there isn't. Now, I'm not Neil Armstrong and I've never been to the moon, so I can't answer that definitively. Some think there is, but the question I would have is, if there was life on other planets, do you not think God would have told us about it in the Bible? That's a simple one, but that's where I'm at with it. There may be, and look, if I'm proved wrong, I'll certainly hold my hands up in heaven, say I got that one wrong. I'll have to, because it'll be perfect. But I have to be honest. But that's just where I'm at with it. I don't think there is. But that's one for a bit more thought. But in general, I don't think there is, personally.
Thank you. The last question.
Okay.
Any animals in heaven?
All right. So again, I'll answer this question by proxy. So I'll give the answer at the end. So whenever God made the earth, he made everything in the earth. He made you and I, and he made stars, planets, the seas, and so on, and he made animals. Now, can any of you tell me whose job was it to name the animals? Adam, that's right. Adam gave the names to all the animals. So, whenever God made Adam, he gave him a job to look after the garden, to dress it, and so on. And part of that was to look after the animals in the Garden of Eden. The Bible tells us we are to be kind and we are to care for animals. Proverbs 12 verse 10 says, "A righteous man regardeth the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." So what it's basically saying there is we should care for animals. It's wrong to mistreat animals because God told Adam to look after the garden and to look after animals. But we must remember, young people, that animals are different to you and I. And they're different in various ways, but the main reason, or the main way they're different for the purpose of this argument is animals don't have souls. They have bodies, but they don't have souls. So, and it doesn't really matter what the animal is. They don't have a conscience. They may know to a degree how to obey commands, but they don't really know morally right and wrong. So they don't have a conscience. So they're not, to use a big term, they're not moral agents. They don't know right and wrong. We do. So I don't think animals are in heaven. I also don't think animals are in hell, for the simple reason that they don't have souls. They're different to you and I. So whenever you lose a wee animal, whether it's a wee pet and maybe you loved it or whatever the animal might be, I don't think personally that animals are in heaven. Now, if you Google it, young people, there's some who think that they are, but I suppose, well, you know by now not to trust everything you Google. So,
that's what I was just about to say. I had an argument about this, but not an argument, a debate from there about this.
okay.
But it was dogs and snakes and pavlova, and he was kind of on saying that there's that heaven, and I said,
You tell him the snake was in heaven. Tell him the old serpents in the other place, you know.
well, I said, no, animals don't have souls.
Yeah,
He Googled it, and it came up, animals do have souls.
they don't though. There's nowhere in the Bible. So whenever God made man in Genesis 2, what did he do? He breathed into him the breath of life, Genesis 2:7, and man became what? A living soul. So when God made Adam, he gave him a soul. When God made the animals, he didn't give them souls. So it would be lovely when we all get to heaven to have our pets with us. I had 6 hamsters whenever I was in primary school. Bruno 2, who replaced Bruno, named after Frank Bruno, the boxer. Then we had Kim, we had Squealer, we had Jumper, and we had Climber. And it'd be lovely if all of them were in heaven, but sadly I don't think they will be. But there you go. So, look, young people, you've listened really well. There's some of those questions were really hard. Some of them weren't so hard, but just required a bit of thought. So, if your questions haven't been answered, we intend to answer them in the next one. But really, thank you very much for listening. You've listened really well. And as Adrian said, Youth Fellowship is the place to ask questions. We're not here to discourage you in any way from asking questions. And you might think your question's stupid. There's no stupid questions here. So we'll do what we can to answer the questions, either publicly or privately. You can ask us. So, Daniel, maybe if you could just close off in prayer, please. Thank you.